Classical music is a term often used to envelop all of Western art music, a kind of cultural colloquialism that, in its own right, attests that the classical period forms the core of the Western musical tradition. Names fostered in this time occupy the center of the musical canon: Haydn, Beethoven, Mozart, a time of virtuosity, genius, and of enlightenment. Yet in a period of such musical vitality, the realm of sacred music found little that could classify a golden age. Already during Bach's lifetime, a decline was evident in Protestant worship in Germany. Under the impact of developing rationalism, the Lutheran liturgy had begun to diminish. Consequently, there was a deterioration in both artistic quality and liturgical suitability of newer music being written for the church. In the search to establish a new style, which would exhibit a kind of noble simplicity, the successors of Baroque composers such as Telemann, Graupner, Foch, and others totally abandoned the grand architectural manner of the late Baroque, established by Bach and other composers in favor of the short, often sentimental, devotional works known as spiritual songs. These were largely characterized by trivial melodic material with an almost threadbare harmonic support. Musical leadership in Europe, and with it the vitality of church music, rapidly switched from the northern states to southern Germany and Austria, and from Protestant to Catholic control. With the birth of the Enlightenment, philosophers such as Kant, Voltaire, and Montesquieu inspired analysis, reason, and individualism. Against such a background, church music found itself in a stronger position in Catholicism than in the Protestant tradition to the north, particularly due to the center point of the Catholic ritual, the Mass, guaranteed a future to music, opposed to the focal point in the sermon of the Protestant worship service.
It's an interesting time because there's a big historical shift to the Enlightenment, and so the Enlightenment in part raises up the power of humankind's brain to answer questions for themselves. So in terms of religion, rather than just digesting what the priest tells you, there's more independence of thought. So there's this big cultural shift going on.
One of the remarkable products of this new era in sacred music was the symphonic mass by members of the Austrian classical school such as Haydn and Mozart. These composers were able to achieve a remarkable fusion of the operatic and dramatic, symphonic, and historic church styles, adapting the sonata and aria forms to the liturgical texts, raising the role of the accompanying orchestra to a truly symphonic level, and at the same time maintaining church tradition by including contrapuntal, usually fugal, choral settings at focal points, particularly in the final paragraphs of the Gloria and the Credo.
So certainly in Baroque, just this climax of structure and form and incredible craftsmanship in terms of how music is made and constructed, the art of counterpoint. And of course, then the Baroque and all its inherent drama derived from opera and oratorio writing. The classical artists inherit actually quite an outstanding tradition in terms of a balance of drama and supreme craftsmanship.
Unfortunately, the drama and huge proportions of such works lie outside the sphere of practicable liturgical settings, belonging more to the realm of the 19th century concert mass in comparison to Bach cantatas that were written specifically for Sunday services.
I think that, I don't know a whole lot about this in part because the big shift in the Romantic period is the classical mass becomes a theater piece, in my opinion. So it moves into concert halls. So you have the Missa Solemnis by Beethoven, which is hardly a liturgical work. It's meant for, everything becomes aggrandized in and some ways colossal with Beethoven, and so this happens to the Mass. So the inheritance from the classical period, I don't know this for sure, but surely Beethoven knew of Haydn's Masses, they become something other, and that other is not liturgical. And even today, you're not likely to hear a classical Mass in a liturgical context. You're going to hear it in a concert hall. And it's some wonderful music, especially Haydn, sort of undersung, underplayed masses that are really full of extraordinary music. In his time, they, of course, worked in the princely palace, but they're just not useful to us today, which is part of why I don't have a lot to say about it.
I can say, of course, there are famous examples, and what I would have heard and know about would be Haydn and Mozart. Beethoven, sort of a special example, although he has an early Mass in C, is it, I think, that he liked a lot, but it didn't really seem to take. And he did it, and this shows you perhaps some of the functions of what composers would do. He wrote the Mass for a special event, for an archduke, and it had something to do with an anniversary of the archduke holding a position, and so it was written for that. And of course it was a Mass, but I think the circumstances weren't, what would you say, regular worship writing?
Worlds away from the composition of such works, there was work being done in England. The enormous influence of Handel, together with the natural conservationism of the English, kept the Baroque styles of church music alive. However, the most gifted composers of sacred music, mainly cathedral organists, were a generation older than Haydn, and more at home in the older style. Since the Anglican service did not require long musical settings, composers confined their writing to anthems and hymns. Composers such as William Boyce, who was the official composer for the Chapel Royal, Maurice Greene, and John Stanley are all known for their orchestral and organ music, but also composed anthems that are still considered important in the sacred canon. Interestingly enough, there is very little, if any, mark left on sacred music from the classical period by that of women composers.
There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of women in this
Right,
era.
and I have this handy Norton Grove Dictionary of Women Composers. I went to the 1700s. I thought, well, you know, if you look in here, I can't tell it. But it has a chronology. And I looked, and it's just all wrote sonatas, wrote operas, did a Singspiel, what else do we have here? Songs with clavier, how to play the keyboard, all sorts. In this chronology, there isn't a mention of a woman writing a sacred work. Maybe some did, but the only one I found was this one mention, but she's late classical, born in 1802, and her works are really done rather early.
Do you know of any women composers in sacred music in the classical period, or was that?
I don't.
Is there a reason for that?
Well, lots of cultural and sociological reasons. And maybe there is someone writing, but it's really Fanny Mendelssohn in the 19th century that you start to hear more about female composers.
With all this in mind, it's safe to say that the classical period is often overlooked in the realm of sacred music. But for why?
I would say Bach's the reason. I mean, just think of that run of cantatas. It's famous to think of his work cranking out a cantata for every week. I think he was a couple of weeks ahead. But also I read somewhere he didn't have really a week to write it because of his rehearsal schedule and having to teach, which he didn't want to do a lot of times. So he had maybe 3 days to crank out a cantata. Wow. And then of course, B minor Mass, that's sort of a kind of, what would you say, put together monument piece or whatever. Was that written for to try to interest somebody? He did several works like that, because a lot of the Mass is redone cantata movements, So I would say the image of Bach, and there were other people who worked as he did. Just think, all his cousins and everybody else that that had an organ job had a church job. So yes, but when you go to the classical, it's not that that doesn't continue, but when you think of major composers, like I said before, they don't seem to be holding down those jobs. Something's happened. Now, I don't know what, but yeah.
With such a pervading inheritance from the Baroque period, it's often said that the classical period was somewhat insignificant in the grand scheme of sacred music.
Well, I would say not in terms of sacred music at all, but certainly history of Western music, Mozart in particular is this mysterious composer that is one of the greatest. And I say mysterious because his music continues to inspire, and in the midst of classicism with all its symmetries and clarities of structure, architecture, form, there's that mystical ingredient in Mozart that makes him so universal and timeless. Certainly, I think the Marriage of Figaro in particular is one of the greatest pieces in the Western canon. Ask me a question again.
Was it an important era for sacred music?
For sacred music, so no, absolutely not. But an important music in terms of sort of connecting to the highest things that humans can achieve, which of course in my world means some kind of God connection. It's just in the classical period that connection isn't through religious music. It's thinking about the human condition, which of course great composers do eternally. So it's a very important period in that regard. Not to minimize Haydn, but I think Mozart, is beside Beethoven and Bach in terms of durability and spectacular suprahuman achievement.
Despite such matters of practicality, there's no doubt that the classical period held paramount works of the secular variety. Haydn's Creation, the Seasons, Mozart's many masses, and similar works held an important place in not only the sacred canon, but of all Western music.
I'm going to play one of those three Mozart pieces that are often played on the organ. They are pieces written for a mechanical clock, and these were a barrel organ is what it's called. And if you imagine a music box, that very small barrel is rotating very slowly, and as it has nubs on it, and as the nub passes the prong, it plays that particular pitch on the prong. So expand that a great deal, turn it into a huge thing, and the barrel would have these pegs that stick out, and as they pass the valve of the pipe, of that particular pipe, it would play. So this was a mechanical instrument, an instrument that was not played by a human being. And so this music is also very complex, but Mozart was frustrated that he had to limit his composition to the compass of the instrument, which was, I think, 2 or 3 octaves, just not very large at all. Yet he put a lot of complexity into it. I'll play just the first section.